In some of my more recent videos, like the gentrification one, or the 15-minute city one, I began by defining the topic more strictly, and then together we peeled back the layers in order to see what's actually going on at the core of it. This time I want to do something a little bit different. Let's begin with the stupidity and work our way back up instead. Here is today's obligatory now deleted viral tweet. What did people do before delivery? What did people do before vaccines? What did people do before medicine? They died or they made do with other things that people shame them for. IDK what to tell you, it's not any different now. The lack of punctuation makes it a bit hard to parse, but this person, who is a brain-dead progressive by the way, they're always brain-dead progressives, is making the point that getting food delivered to your door via DoorDash or Uber Eats, or any similar service, should now be considered essential, just like vaccines and medicine is. The argument of what did people do before delivery is obviously they went out and got the food themselves, or they cooked at home. But this woman rejects that argument for the same reason that they reject the what did people do before vaccines and medicine argument. Her view seems to be that we no longer live in the past where vaccines, medicine, and delivery didn't yet exist, and now that they do, they should be considered essential. It's the same type of argument as the people who say that internet access should be considered a human right in the modern era, since it's so commonplace and necessary to do a lot of things. Here, I'll add some punctuation to her tweet so you can actually see what she's saying. It's properly read as, they died or made do with other things people shame them for, period. I don't know what to tell you, it's not any different now. Her argument is that before medicine, people made do by either dying or by using older things they had access to, and that those people back then were also shamed for using those older things, just as they would be shamed for needing medicine now, or vaccines, or food delivery. Now, of course, one of these things is not like the other. You might die if you don't get your medicine or your vaccine, depending on how serious your condition is. The chance that you're gonna die if you don't get your DoorDash delivery is pretty low in comparison. And if you actually are about to die without your DoorDash, you've got so many other problems that food delivery is the least of your worries. Well, this viral tweet kicked off the DoorDash Discourse, where people online argued over whether or not food delivery was an essential service in 2024. Most sane individuals just laughed at this chick and moved on, causing her to lock down her Twitter account, as you do when you take an L this big. We won't dwell too long on it because this is just the gateway to the actual topic, but I will show you the craziest take to come out of this whole mess. This guy said that he DM'd one of his friends, a fellow named Zach the Zoroa. This is a he, they, flags, and bio kind of guy. He said to this very progressive friend of his that someone who is so disabled that they're incapable of microwaving a meal needs hands-on medical care and not DoorDash. Well, this was Zach's reply. Imagine spending your time attacking people feeding themselves instead of spending your energy going after the people who make it harder for disabled people to even go outside. You're spineless. By the way, I DoorDash because my family is food insecure, but I have partners who help me order lunch. I can't cook, and I shouldn't have to ask your permission to be able to feed myself in a way that works for me. If you actually cared about disabled people, you would advocate for proper meal delivery services that listen to dietary restrictions and aren't only for 60+ physically disabled people. But you'll spend most of your time attacking people you've never met instead of lifting a finger to help the most vulnerable in your community because you don't actually care if we starve. One less useless mouth to feed, right? My brother in Christ, the only thing he said was, you need more help than DoorDash. This guy says that his family is food insecure. His family probably being that leftist polycule, by the way. He's got multiple partners. Food insecurity is a term used by the US Department of Agriculture to describe people who don't have enough to eat and don't know where their next meal will come from, aka people who are homeless or extremely poor. If you have the fucking money to DoorDash, you are not food insecure. That shit is expensive. Moreover, you can DoorDash every meal if you want, bro, go ahead. But it's up to you to pay for it, my dude. You don't just get to have restaurant cooked meals for every single meal of the day for free. This exemplifies the incredible level of entitlement around the DoorDash discourse, where people think that they are just owed food for existing. But not in the form of food stamps or anything like that. There should actually be somebody else out there who cooks food and delivers it to their door for free, because they have the right to be fed. And if you point out all the obvious holes in this idea, like, the people who do all this have to be paid, you are an ableist. The whole paying for it part of the conversation being left out of the DoorDash discourse is just amazing to me, considering the other DoorDash discourse that's been happening at the same time. Though this time it's not just DoorDash and other food delivery services. It's also stuff like Uber and Lyft and various other sectors of the online gig economy. The model of work that these companies use has been under attack from left-wing activists for several years now. Let me briefly explain what a gig economy is. A gig is a job, obviously. A gig worker is somebody who isn't consistently employed by a business. Rather, he works individual jobs. The IRS defines the gig economy as activity where people earn income providing on-demand work, services, or goods, nowadays often through a digital platform like an app or a website. The BBC defines it as a labor market characterized by the prevalence of short-term contracts or freelance work, as opposed to permanent jobs. For low-level steady employment, you're paid by the hour. You attend work for your pre-scheduled shifts, there's generally no shortage of work to do, and you work until your time is up. It doesn't actually matter if you accomplish more or less work than the other worker. You both get paid the same wage for the same time. At least it doesn't matter in the short term. The more productive worker might be up for promotion sooner than you, depending on the workplace. Gig employment is the total opposite of this model. You're not paid by the hour, you're paid by the job. The employer generally still has no shortage of work to do, but you pick and choose whichever jobs you want to do. First come, first serve. For example, look at Uber drivers. They might choose to answer 20 calls a night through the Uber app, and then get paid for those 20 deliveries. They might choose to be available all night, but after a few calls they have an emergency, and have to stop early, so they stop accepting requests. Maybe on some nights they just don't want to work at all. Gig employment sacrifices the consistent pay and relative job security of steady employment, and in exchange you get control over when and how much you work. Of course, there are many other forms of employment besides just these two, but gig employment has been on the rise because people tend to enjoy having control over their time. A 2016 study showed that gig workers increased by 50% between 2005 and 2015, with that growth accounting for 94% of all American employment growth during that time. By 2021, 16% of all American workers had become gig workers, with the majority of them being young people, who again cite freedom over when they can work as the main reason they choose these jobs. Despite all of this, there's a perplexing push from more left-leaning people to reclassify these gig jobs as steady employment. The activists are claiming that companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash exploit their workers by not providing them an hourly wage or benefits or any of the other perks that come with steady employment. But that payment structure is justified by the fact that in exchange, the company has control over the worker's time. The added flexibility of a gig job means that you choose when you work, which also means that you choose how much or how little you work, and accordingly, how much or little you earn. Turning gig jobs into steady employment strips away the flexibility that people are attracted to. In areas where the activists have won, the consequences have been pretty predictable. For example, in 2021 in the UK, the Supreme Court decided that Uber drivers are not actually self-employed contractors, but they are employees of Uber. 1 year later, Vice wrote an article about Uber in the UK. Why is it still impossible to get a ride? In March of 2021, the Supreme Court ruled that Uber drivers should be entitled to workers' rights, including a guaranteed national living wage, holiday pay, and pension plan. Uber then swiftly increased its service fee to 25% on all fares, meaning they pocket a quarter of the money earned by each driver on every trip. They also introduced upfront pricing, meaning that customers now pay a flat rate as opposed to paying per mile and minute. This has caused drivers to lose out on longer fares. Now, you might immediately blame Uber for passing along the costs of the UK's regulations to the driver and the customer, rather than eating those costs themselves. They're the greedy capitalists. Surely they've got a ton of money. Those CEOs just want to hoard it for themselves. Well, that is a fairy tale that can rope anybody in. The leftoids can blame capitalism, and the rightoids can blame globalist corporations. But it's ultimately not true. Uber has been operating for 14 years and just posted its first ever profitable year in 2023. It's burned through $32 billion of investment money to get to this point, and it's only here now because of their recent aggressive pricing model. There is no blood to squeeze from the Uber stone, unfortunately, and it wouldn't surprise me if similar app-based gig services are in the same boat. Outside of the UK, activists in California pushed for a similar restriction on Uber and Lyft, but it was ultimately overturned by the court. But in Seattle, the regulation went through, mandating higher wages for DoorDash-style delivery services, and it was disastrous. $26 coffees, $32 sandwiches, customers abandoning the apps, and drivers ultimately losing a ton of money. In Minneapolis, a similar regulation passed, this time for rideshare apps like Uber. In response, Lyft announced that they were pulling their service from the city because it was no longer affordable to operate there. Of course, rather than actually discuss the economic situation, Twitter activists instead called Lyft racist for abandoning their black and immigrant drivers and customer base. On the federal level, the US Department of Labor walked up to the line of declaring Uber and Lyft drivers as employees, not contractors, but they didn't cross it. Some analysts believe that the Biden White House's pro-union stance will lead to Uber contractors eventually being classified as employees, noting that, just like in the UK, this move would raise Uber and Lyft's costs. And then there was the whole Etsy strike thing from last year. Etsy is another gig economy app. This time it's an online marketplace, specifically for selling artisan products or homemade crafts. You know, the sort of thing that isn't mass-produced. Though, of course, as the site boomed in popularity, they did eventually declare that mass-produced items could be sold on Etsy, ruining the whole point of it, but whatever. The Etsy strike happened in the summer of 2023, when Etsy announced a new policy of not paying sellers 75% of their earnings until after a 45-day waiting period. Etsy claimed that this was to ensure that enough money was set aside to be able to cover refunds. As a result of this policy, sellers on Etsy began to organize a strike, setting their shops to closed until the policy was reversed. A few days later, Etsy bowed to the massive public outcry and reversed the decision. Mostly. This isn't the only Etsy strike, though. The hashtag Etsy strike trended on Twitter back in 2022, where Etsy announced that they were increasing their cut of sales made on the site by 30%. Etsy's COO said, "The new fee structure will enable us to increase our investments in areas including marketing, customer support, and removing listings that don't meet our policies." And despite the strike peaking at 14,000 sellers, I can't find any evidence that this policy was ever rolled back by Etsy. A lot of the wider Etsy story feels like the Patreon story, where Patreon declared that it desperately needed to charge its creators more because it just wasn't a profitable service. But at the same time, it was also expanding into other areas that no one really asked for, as it began to exert more and more control over the creators using the service. Let's take a look at this thread on the Etsy strike from a black biracial illustrator trying to survive capitalism. Critical support to hashtag Etsy strike, because while without stronger organization it's very difficult to hit these companies in the pockets as much as we want, the coverage has the potential to make us and the public much more aware of what we're up against and what our economic class really is. If you make money on social media and marketplaces as an artist or a creator of any kind, you are treading an increasingly blurry line between sole proprietor and working/employee class. And we need to realize our interests are shared with those of traditional employees and gig workers much more than they're shared with a select few creators who make it and live ridiculously comfortable lives. You and the charisma of your work are creating profit for Etsy, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, etc. And it's no coincidence that appeasing the algorithm is feeling more and more like a traditional job that demands as much of your time as it can. They are profiting off of our labor. We are working for them, not ourselves, not anymore. The artisan class is shrinking. Capitalism will proletarianize as many people as it possibly can, so we need to unite as workers. We need to be in solidarity with the Uber drivers and fast food employees and the unemployed and the homeless people, always. Join a local organization or a party, learn as much as you can, and support labor and community organizers and strikes in your area. The future of not only your livelihood as an independent creator or traditional employee, but of this entire planet depends on the working classes getting educated and organized. Yeah, so a lot of this is commie gobbledygook, but let's actually consider what's being said here. Hell, she mentioned YouTubers. I'm personally in this boat. I post videos to YouTube, and I get paid based on ad revenue. The more popular a video is, the more money I get, roughly. And I can choose how much I work. I can ram out as many videos as I can, or I can take a month-long break. There's no YouTube boss kicking down my door demanding I go punch in for my shift at the YouTube video factory. Just like Etsy or Patreon or DoorDash or Uber, the road YouTube took to achieve profitability was a perilous one. They are making money now, but it took them a pretty long time to get there. If YouTube was forced to treat every YouTuber as an hourly employee, I promise you, 1, the high-end YouTubers would make a lot less. 2, YouTube would be paying people a lot more, mainly to low-end YouTubers who frankly don't deserve the pay based on their low views. And 3, the job of YouTubing would lose its flexibility, which is one of the big perks. And those talented, high-skilled people would probably leave for greener pastures. So, as a person who actually works one of these gig jobs, I personally prefer things as they are. If my job was turned into an hourly one where I had more job security but less freedom over when I worked, how I worked, what I worked on, I wouldn't want to do this. In exchange for that loss of stability, I have command over my working life in a way that your average worker doesn't. And that is worth more than money, at least to me. Okay, let's break out Marx again and decode what this person's actually saying. In this section, she says, if you make money on social media or marketplace apps, you're treading an increasingly blurry line between sole proprietor and working class. And we need to realize our interests are shared with those of traditional employees. This is referring to the petty bourgeois. In my What Exactly is Woke video, I outlined that the proletariat are workers who don't own, and the bourgeois are owners who don't work. Pretty basic stuff. I also mentioned 2 other classes that weren't part of that conversation. One of those classes is the petty bourgeois. The petty bourgeois both own and work the means of production. This is the small shopkeeper who owns his shop but still works in it, providing his own labor and not simply extracting surplus value through ownership right. If the small shopkeeper has a couple of employees, he nonetheless still exploits them as the bourgeois would, by extracting surplus value from his workers' labor, despite also providing his own labor to the enterprise. The petty bourgeois lives a personal lifestyle that is like the proletariat's, but due to his different relationship with the means of production as an owner, his class interests are aligned with the bourgeois. To put it very simply, if the bourgeois own but don't work, and the proletariat work but don't own, the petty bourgeois own and work. When our communist friend talks about what our economic class really is, in her Etsy strike thread, she's referring to the fact that contractors, gig workers, Etsy sellers, Uber drivers, YouTubers are all, in some way, petty bourgeois. We don't sell our labor to a boss for a steady hourly wage. We sell it to a customer on a per-job basis, whether that's per product, per delivery, or per video. Marxists consistently view the petty bourgeois as a class that basically needs to shit or get off the pot. They would prefer that the petty bourgeois side with the proletariat due to their shared lifestyle. That's what the whole "our economic class really is" comment is pointing at. But Marxists also don't trust the petty bourgeois due to their class interests being aligned against the proletariat. I did a video a year or two ago about the whole Hitler particles meme and the hatred that socialists have for self-employed people, so this might sound like I'm retreading old ground to some of you. Trotsky wrote the essay What is National Socialism in 1933, where he famously said, "The controversy over Hitler's personality becomes sharper the more the secret of his success is sought in himself." In the meantime, another political figure would be difficult to find that is in the same measure the focus of anonymous historic forces. Not every exasperated petty bourgeois could have become Hitler, but a particle of Hitler is lodged in every exasperated petty bourgeois. The rapid growth of German capitalism prior to the First World War by no means signified a simple destruction of the middle class. Although it ruined some layers of the petty bourgeois, it created others anew, around the factories, artisans, and shopkeepers, within the factories, technicians, and executives. But while preserving themselves and even growing numerically, the middle classes have lost the last shadow of independence. They live on the periphery of large-scale industry in the banking system, and they live off the crumbs from the table of the monopolies and cartels. What Trotsky is saying here is that the petty bourgeois, the self-employed independent person, was the backbone of Hitler's support in Nazi Germany. The small business person who had worked very hard to pull themselves out of the working class and carve out their own little independent domain was at risk of losing everything to the socialist revolution. So in desperation, they support any regime that will promise them ownership of their little shop, no matter how oppressive or tyrannical that regime might be. A particle of Hitler is lodged in every petty bourgeois because Trotsky believed that the personal drive to be independent and self-sufficient manifested on an international scale as a drive to de-link the German nation from its connections and obligations to wider humanity, to be independent from it. The moral underpinning of the socialist project is, in layman's terms, that whole "we are all connected" vibe, which means that all humans have a universal responsibility to all other humans, which justifies things like collective ownership or redistribution. There's a lot of problems with Trotsky, but for this conversation, he incorrectly considered the independence-oriented personal ethic of the petty bourgeois to be political support for its independence-oriented geopolitical counterpart in the Nazis. Over time, this became the Hitler particles meme, where now we have like Hitler particle detectors and stuff. But the underlying idea remains. Socialists might hate capitalism, but they regard with suspicion people who try to achieve independence from capitalism not as their class, but as empowered individuals. Socialists prop up a global interconnected capitalism not because they support it, but because they believe they are its inheritors, and the existence of people who are more independent from that system are one of their biggest political roadblocks. And in case you think I'm just pulling this directly out of my ass, like I don't understand Marx or Trotsky, and there's no real leftist who actually thinks like this, let's take a quick look at, for example, Laurie Penny, feminist, socialist, Guardian columnist, and giver of bad takes extraordinaire. She pretty much agrees with me. Stop waiting for the real Nazis to show up. They're here. White supremacy today doesn't look like the organized party system of the 20th century, because it doesn't need to. This is gig economy fascism, entrepreneurial white supremacy, serving the interests of tyrants by proxy. What she's calling gig economy fascism is the petty bourgeois, the small business person, the entrepreneur, whose class interests drive him towards independence, outside of the superstructure that the socialists intend to one day control. So, rewinding all the way back to our Etsy communist, she's basically saying that the petty bourgeois, who are currently earning their own independence as gig workers within the current system, must be made to understand that they're not actually free or independent. Their efforts to become so interfere with the socialist project of collective freedom, and they basically need to give up their aspirations, start acting like workers, strike against Etsy, argue for better pay and job security, and etc., rather than behaving like the self-employed people they actually are. Which, if you think about it, is pretty hypocritical. Look at her statements here. They're profiting off our labor. Yeah, it does make sense that they do because they provide a middleman service. You can always go be an independent cab driver on your own. Just go put up flyers around your city with your phone number on it, or go code your own app or something. You don't do that because it costs money and time. Uber handles the logistical stuff, and you use their service as a contractor to put you in contact with potential customers. Uber is a matching service, not an employer. Drivers don't work for them. They don't want to work for them. They shouldn't work for them. The service they provide is one you have to pay for, whether you do it yourself or you have Uber do it, which is why it's fine that they take a cut. Capitalism will proletarianize as many people as it possibly can. In Marxism, proletarianization is the process by which other classes become proletarian. For the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois, proletarianization means the loss of ownership of the means of production. The business owner who goes bankrupt and must take a job to survive has been proletarianized. What the Etsy communist is saying is that these gig economy jobs, like Uber and DoorDash and Etsy and YouTube, though they are petty bourgeois jobs, the people in these jobs are being proletarianized. We are working for them, not ourselves. Her claim is that these companies continuously making it harder for their contractors is a form of class warfare against the petty bourgeois and an attempt to turn them into wage slaves. This may or may not be true, but her solution to the problem is retarded. When Uber and Lyft were told by the UK government that their drivers were now employees and not contractors, that is also proletarianization, and it is what the socialists advocated for. The socialists don't actually want small businesses to get ahead. They don't want the petty bourgeois to exist at all. If all of the small businesses are absorbed into large corporations, if all of the small business people become proletarianized, then society hastens towards a class conflict between the proletarian and the bourgeois that socialists believe is inevitable. This is why the Etsy commie's solution is view yourself as a proletarian anyway, behave like a proletarian, organize into a union, go on strike. Anytime you see stuff like the Etsy strike or the Twitch blackout or anything else like that, it's the activists telling the petty bourgeois that they have a moral obligation to abandon their own prosperity, voluntarily become proletarian, and join the revolution. It's all nonsense, of course. In the book, The Petite Bourgeoisie, Comparative Studies of the Uneasy Stratum, the morality of the proletarian class is described as consisting of entrepreneurship, self-help, individualism, frugality, and family values. These are all things that socialists tend to oppose, either because it's socially reactionary morality, like individualism and family values, or it's capitalist morality, like frugality and entrepreneurship. Self-help falls into both camps. But moreover, these proletarian virtues are shared with the petty bourgeois, and they have provided a solid bulwark against their proletarianization. In fact, these virtues have allowed some proletarians to work hard and become petty bourgeois themselves. Another book on this topic, A Nation of Shopkeepers, is written by Dan Evans, a more modern socialist type. He's neither an intersectionalist nor an orthodox Marxist. He outlines how, against the predictions of all mainstream socialist theorists, the petty bourgeois have continued to grow in population, with their independence-oriented, hustle, grind-set values coming to dominate our culture. This book deserves a larger video another time, as I both agree with and disagree with a lot of it. But Evans ultimately comes to the same conclusion as our communist Etsy striker. What would now be most transformative for the petty bourgeois, not just politically but psychologically, would be to abandon social mobility, to dispense with its obsessive focus on climbing the career ladder, to embrace and accept downward social mobility, to realize that one can have an identity without having a career, and that there is nothing wrong with staying rooted and not leaving your small town. That last point about small towns is related to a different part of the book outside the scope of this video, but the rest of it mirrors what our communist Etsy friend said. The socialist salvation for the petty bourgeois is for the class to abandon its entrepreneurial character, and socialists have an obligation to nudge this process along in order to prevent the rising support of fascism. I completely disagree. This is just another accelerationist position, where more people become workers and therefore become revolutionaries. The entrepreneurial spirit is the engine that creates the material differences between the proletariat and the petty bourgeois, and the socialist position necessitates crushing that spirit. Maybe this is a form of Nietzsche's will to power, where some people are driven by self-determination rather than money or status. There is certainly a personality type out there which rejects the utilitarian notion that all people really just want pleasure or happiness, and therefore maximizing well-being is the goal. There really are people out there who would rather be sadder or in more pain if it meant that they were otherwise the masters of their own fate. In fact, I think a lot of this conversation comes down to something like innate personality differences. As someone who is technically petty bourgeois, I can tell you personally, what motivates me is the desire for independence, self-sufficiency, control over my time, choosing what work I do and when. I'm willing to work a less stable job in exchange for those benefits. I think there are just some people out there who are more prone to taking risks than others, and as long as those personality types exist, their preferred lifestyle will always mean that socialism doesn't work. This is probably also why socialists tend to demonize those people. So, we've now explored the socialist position on the self-employed, the self-sufficient person. Rewinding all the way back to our initial gig economy conversation, we can now see why the socialists decry the gig economy, while nonetheless wanting to accelerate the negative effects they believe the gig economy imposes on gig workers. The TLDR of it is, they're angry that gig workers have managed to rise above their station within capitalism, rather than revolting against it, and they're hoping that the risky nature of the gig economy eventually punishes them for it. But the chance of that happening anytime soon is actually pretty low, at least according to these two books. And what makes this whole conversation exceptionally ridiculous is going all the way back to the very start with that nonsense DoorDash discourse, with the person putting home food delivery in the same basket as vaccines and medicine, as if they are somehow essential to modern living in the same way. Okay, DoorDash is now an essential service in 2024, at least according to this progressive. That means the people delivering the food, the gig workers who work on a per-job basis using the DoorDash app, their labor is now necessary in order to provide this essential service. But DoorDash is a gig job. The people working it can choose to work it or not work it as much as they want. What's the best way of ensuring a steady stream of those essential DoorDash deliveries? It seems to be converting DoorDash from a gig job into steady employment, where DoorDash drivers are not contractors who can work based on their own whims, but employees where they must work consistently. Of course, the problem is, as we saw with the examples earlier, it doesn't really work that way. You end up getting a shittier service instead, as all of those independent contractors move on to greener pastures. At the end of the day, the whole DoorDash discourse and the gig economy discourse, they're both happening in the wider context of online communists debating which is more problematic, cooking your own food at home or having somebody else cook your food in a restaurant. One position is that restaurants are problematic, and under communism they would be abolished, as being forced to cook for other people is just another form of exploitation, and restaurant enjoyers are simply bourgeois sympathizers. On the commune, everyone will cook their own meals for themselves, and nobody will be exploited. The other communist position is that cooking at home is a reactionary, gender stereotypical behavior that individualist NIMBYs engage in. By consuming food in an individualist manner rather than a collective one, you are simply reproducing individualism, that problematic petty bourgeois morality. Under communism, everyone will be fed at a collective kitchen, as everyone owning their own kitchen is a waste of resources. The DoorDash thing is just a small conversation inside of this larger, long-standing debate in the communist movement, whether it's home cooking or collective cooking that is more reactionary and problematic. The real answer, of course, is that communism solves this debate by not having any food at all.